Hey guys, a leak on the rear rocker box of my 2014 Street Glide required replacing the lower rocker box gaskets. You can see I have taken the fuel tank off. I ran the bike so there's only about a gallon and a half in it. Less gas, the easier it is to lift that thing up. Here I'm cleaning off the top of the engine, just get any junk off of it before I start opening it up. I also got my air hose and just blew off whatever I could. Tools needed for the job. Well, first of all, you'll need some brake clean, a little piece of ScotchBrite pad that you'll see me use later. You need, it certainly helps to have a special 7/16 socket for the bolts I'm taking off here on the upper rocker box covers, as well as the lower part, the lower rocker boxes. Especially when you get under the frame. I did not have it. I ordered the wrong one, so I had to make do with open-end wrenches and sockets. Here I'm using a dead blow hammer to knock these loose, and once that's done, you can take them off easily. Be careful taking off the old gaskets. Those things are as sharp as razor blades. So you also need an adapter so you can use a torque wrench, because you're not going to be able to get it under the frame. So I'll show you later on the tool that I used, or I'll post a link for it. It's just something you can use to put an open-end wrench or that special socket I was talking about, and then get a hold of it using the torque wrench. And as long as you're using that adapter with the torque wrench at a 90-degree angle, you don't have to do any torque wrench calculations. If you use it as an extension, you definitely do, so be aware of that. So now the covers are off. Next up is the breathers. I'm going to post a video by Brad the Wizard, who is a Harley tech, and it's an hour-long video of him doing this job from A to Z. I'll put up a link to it in this video and in the description. On the bike he did, which was a 2008, he couldn't get those breathers out because they were hitting on the rear cylinder. It was hitting the frame, so he had to kind of lift those out with the rocker support plate, which I'm loosening now. But there was no space issue with those breathers on my 2014. So these rocker box support plates, they were pretty tight. They're supposed to be 18 foot-pounds, and between the gears in the engine and the thread lock and everything, they were really pretty tight. So you just take your time breaking that thread lock free and getting these loose. Now to do this, you have to rotate. First of all, let me back up. You want to take the spark plugs out. Obviously, the bike's got to be up in the air, and you need to put it in 6th gear so you can rotate the back wheel and turn the engine. So you need to rotate it so the front cylinder is in what's called overlap position, and then the pressure is off the rockers on the rear cylinder. And there's a way to check those rockers, slide them back and forth. You'll hear them click so you know they're not under pressure. And I'll show that later in the video. So once I do that, I'm taking out the rear support plate, and then I'm going to rotate the engine again now so the front cylinder is not under pressure, and take that support plate out. So now that I've done that, I'm popping out these 2 O-rings. As far as parts needed, I put in new O-rings, new breathers, because you're going to need the breather gasket anyway, and the breathers are pretty cheap. And I used Harley gaskets as well. So all OEM parts. So the last part of the disassembly is taking out these lower rocker boxes themselves. And there's 6 bolts on, or actually it might be 5 bolts on those. And this is a tool that I thought would work, but it didn't fit. It was for the Evo engine. So open-end wrenches, sockets, combination of both. And this definitely slowed me down, not having the right tool. So I'll put a link for the tool that you do want to use. So once I have all of the bolts out for both of these, I'm going to use the dead blow hammer again. And this is going to take more hits. You'll hear it break free. And then you're going to do the same. I'm hitting it on the corner there because that's the part that's hidden by the fuel tank. There's some wiring in the way on the front one, and I didn't want to chance it, so I just went around to the other side. And the front one tends to pop free easier. I guess the back, because it gets more heat, things are a little more baked on. So, lifting these out, no issue with the gasket or any leaking on this front one. That's a perfectly healthy looking gasket. However, the rear one obviously is going to look a little different. Lifting these out, sometimes when you're close to the frame, you got to play around with getting just the right angle, and it's even more fun putting it back together with the bolts sometimes. So, you know, having done this, never done this before, everything was a first time. I did do this job on a Sportster, but it was way easier. Okay, so here you can see the gasket, some of the orange is missing, and you can see some black and stuff where, like some gunk from the oil. This really isn't bad. This was the very beginnings of the leak. Now I'm going to take a little piece of ScotchBrite, just cut like a little 1-inch square, and you can see there's a lot of orange bits left on the head. Obviously very important to not let that get in the engine. So wherever you have passageways and channels and stuff, you're going to use a rag and cover that up and pull the debris away from the engine. You don't have to worry about the bolt holes because we'll get to cleaning those out momentarily. But this was somewhat time consuming. You've got to go over both heads very thoroughly and get all that gasket material out of the way. Once I got that all done on both cylinders, I then used brake clean and wiped down these surfaces so they were all nice and dry. Take a closer look at the gasket. That was the good one, and this is the one that had failed. All right, so now I'm got the front cylinder cleaned up. What I'm doing now is I'm taking brake clean and spraying it into a couple of the bolt holes, and I'm covering it up with the cloth. Then I'm following that with a blast of air. And obviously don't want the brake clean and whatever gook is in there to get in the engine. So I want to catch it with that rag or have it blow away from the engine. So this is very important. If you have oil left in these holes and you're tightening down the bolt, that oil has nowhere to go. It can actually crack your head. And just a little oil residue will prevent the new thread locker from curing properly. So after I did this, I used a flashlight in a mirror just to check each hole and make sure they were clean and dry. So I would say this is a very critical part of this job. Next, you got to go to all these pieces that were taken off the bike, get that ScotchBrite pad, same thing. Go over them, clean them, then dry it all off with brake clean. This one's done, and there's no debris or particles or anything. Nice and clean as a whistle. Very important to be clean. This was strange. Clearly not something they should have put on a new bike. This is my makeshift holder to raise my light up. I gotta upgrade that. So keep watching my videos. On my table there, I had the front and rear cylinder parts segregated, and I had things set up so that I could put the same bolts back in the same cylinders. These gaskets for the lower rocker box, it's the same gasket, and you have to flip it around. It says front cylinder and rear cylinder on it. So a key thing to make sure you put those on right. I set these lower rocker boxes in place. I keep calling them lower rocker boxes. I guess those are the rocker boxes and the other pieces are the covers. But before I went any further, I think I counted 36 bolts, and every one of them had to be wire wheeled to get all the dried thread locker off of it. Again, you want that new thread lock to take and to cure, so very important to do that. This is the assembly of the new breathers. They go in like so. You'll see that comes with the gasket there on each side. And it comes with new bolts with a thread lock on already, so you don't have to worry about that. Now came the next part of the job, which really slowed me down, and that was getting the gasket off the support plate. It was fused on there, very brittle, and couldn't be removed easily. Now here's what it looked like after I removed it and cleaned it with ScotchBrite and brake clean and all that. But I'm going to show you here. You take a bolt and pop out one of these rods and then take out the rocker. And what that'll do is it'll allow you, yeah, it's kind of slippery because I had oil on it. It'll allow you to slide a razor blade on the surface at the right angle. Now when you put this back together, there is a notch you need to pay attention to. And that notch actually allows a bolt to pass through and kind of hold that in place. So if you put it together wrong, you're not going to be able to get that bolt in. Ask me how I know that. So that's important. So these support plates, they have two tiny little holes for oil draining that want to make sure you blow those out so there's no debris blocking those. And, every part you're working on, clean it with brake clean. Now some parts I oiled with just 20W50 oil. Some people use assembly lube on the engine parts. I didn't have that available, so I just used some oil. And in retrospect, I wish I did use the assembly lube. I'll talk about that later. What I'm doing here is I'm taking a couple of the bolts from the support plate and I'm putting them through the rocker box so that when I put the rocker box bolts in, I want to be able to slide the rocker box around and make sure these support plate holes are lined up. You definitely don't want to have that rocker box torqued down, and then when you go to put the support plate in, the bolts are off center and they're very tight, because now you're going to start shaving metal and stuff like that. So this just allowed me to position the rocker box in a spot where it was kind of the natural position. Next, I put in the O-ring. That's obviously very important. It would really stink to get halfway through or all the way through and then find your new O-rings sitting there on your workbench. So I definitely had a checklist I worked off of when I did this, and I had some highlighted points, and one of them was definitely not to forget the O-rings. Like any good job, especially if you're not a mechanic who does this kind of thing every day, preparation, research, making sure you have the right parts and tools. YouTube is obviously huge because you can watch the job being done. As I was taking things apart, I was already familiar with what I was going to see, and I felt like I knew what I was doing to the extent possible. At this point now, I have both of the rocker boxes in place, and I'm torquing the bolts. And I'm just using my small torque wrench on the front. It's very easy to get to all the bolts. But on the rear, I definitely needed to use that adapter that I was talking about. Actually, here's an example of using that adapter with an open-end wrench. Now here I'm using it as an extension, so that does require adjusting the torque on the wrench to accommodate what was an additional 4 inches of extension. But if you don't want to go through all that, you want to do it at 90 degrees. Now the lower boxes are all torqued down. Everything is just the way I want it, and it's as clean as a whistle. Now I'm going to go back to the rocker support plate, and I'm going to take my engine oil and I'm going to put this in a few key positions, basically the spots where the rocker is going to make contact. So I have the support plate upside down, and I'm putting it on the ears of the rockers, and one end of those is going to touch the valves, and the other ends is where the push rods are going to seat in. The advantage of using assembly lube is it's not as runny or liquidy, and it'll stay put longer while oil comes up. So now I'm setting the front support plate in place, and if you're doing this in the same order as you removed it, this front cylinder will be in the rested position because the rear cylinder is in the overlap position. You definitely don't want to be loosening and tightening the support plate with extra stress on it from the valves and push rods. So I'm just kind of doing all these bolts by hand just to make sure everything's going together nice. I don't want to feel any undue resistance, and I want to make sure everything's in the right position. Now I'm going to put the breather in. You definitely don't want to tighten down the breather until the support plate is torqued down, because you don't want any undue stress on those bolts for the breather. So just keep that in mind. Now at this point in the reassembly, there is going to be some pressure on the support plate, so I'm not going to be able to move those rockers back and forth. You have to wait for something called bleed down. And until that process happens, you can't really go ahead doing anything else on this cylinder, and you definitely don't want to be rotating the engine. So it took about 20 minutes for the bleed down process to happen. So while I was waiting for that, since the support plate was already torqued down, I did the breather bolts and torqued those down. Alright, so off camera, the bleed down completed. I rotated the engine, so now I can work on the rear cylinder. Same process as before, but a little more challenging because of the clearance between this and the frame. So you'll see I have some bolts in the support plate, and that's actually what I needed to do to be able to set it into place. So a little trial and error back and forth, and then eventually I got it in there. And angling it and coming in from the front of the bike and then sliding it back towards where it goes is what makes the difference. Then again, just starting all the bolts by hand, making sure nothing's being forced. So now I have those all torqued up, and I'm putting in the breather. And while I'm working on the breather, this rear cylinder has now got to do the bleed down process. So that's just going to take, like I said, about 20 minutes or so. When bleed down's complete, there'll be no question. Reach in and grab the rocker, and you'll be able to freely move both of them. Now I'm putting on the upper gaskets for the rocker box covers. Just fiddling around trying to get it in. The rear one was a little more challenging because of the frame. That's what it looked like once it was in. And now the job is done. Everything should be great, right? Well, not really. What the heck is that noise? Well guys, the last thing I expected when I hit that starter was to hear a noise like that. I panicked, immediately cut the engine, and was just so bummed out. What went wrong? I couldn't understand it. I knew I did this job to the T, followed all the procedures, did it just right. I didn't know what was going on. So I called it a night, got cleaned up, had some food, then hit the internet. And soon I found people who did the rocker box job and had the same kind of issue that I had. And eventually I found the answer. Someone explained that when you first start the engine, you've got to run it at a higher idle and rev the engine a few times and give it about a minute for oil pressure to build up and for the oil to reach the top of the engine. That sounded too good to be true, but it seemed to make sense. So that's what I did. And after about 45 seconds, it quieted right down. And now I was elated. So I shut it off, turned it back on again, sounded perfect. The next morning I took it out for a 40-mile ride,
It runs beautifully. There's no leak anymore. So I'm calling this one a success. Definitely check out the links in the description if you're looking to do this job yourself. And as long as you prepare well and use the right materials and parts and tools, you should be able to do it yourself. Thanks for watching, guys. Till next time.